In just a moment, I'll invite our featured speakers to introduce themselves, but I first want to remind everyone that this session is using a regular Zoom meeting style. Right now we're spotlighted, but when we're done introducing ourselves, we'll turn that off and have more of a regular Zoom meeting feel. And as the purpose of this session is to kukakuka around questions and challenges and whatever successes we may have for those of us who are working in knowledge organization and those interested in knowledge organization or supporting this work with your colleagues and your communities. And so at any moment, feel free to enter any questions or comments or anything on your mind into the chat. As soon as we open up into our regular Zoom meeting style, I'll have a couple of questions to start us off, but you can also choose to raise your hand and then we can unmute you and you can ask your question live. Again, this is meant to be talk story style as much as Zoom can accommodate that remotely for all of us today. So take a moment to ask Sharon and Whina to introduce themselves. Whina, do you want to get us started?
Kia ora tātou, ka nui te mihi kia koutou I toi mai nei runga tēnei kaupapa. Mā I o arata kina mai tātou katoa I runga te kaupapa, aroha ki te whenua, aroha ki te rangi, aroha ki te moana, aroha ki ngā tūpuna, aroha ki ngā iwi, take iwi Māori, ngā whānau katono reira. Tēnā koutou. Hi everyone, aroha nui kia koutou. My name is Whina Te Whiu. At the moment I'm a curator at a museum in Kaitaia in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I like to think I'm an activist in libraries and museum spaces and have worked with creating Māori subject headings for Aotearoa and for everyone to use around the world. And really that was a project 15 years ago. And so I still do training for library staff through the New Zealand Libraries Partnership Program. And we do training around Māori subject headings with our non-Indigenous cataloguing partners in that program and we do about 6 trainings per year. And I'm just so happy and excited for this kaupapa and this day. It's just been really wonderful to hear from our whānau in Canada and also the what's going on in Hawaii. I want to mihi to all the speakers and to all our coordinators and organisers for this kaupapa. It's rare that we get the chance to talk story amongst ourselves and to challenge each other as to what the heck are we doing, and also the idea of access, which isn't really about access, it's really about connection and reconnecting relationships between ourselves and our own Indigenous knowledge, and then taking that knowledge and expressing it through ourselves in this time. And that's really what it is. And it's really about decolonising ourselves, let alone institutions. So ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I hope that was challenging enough. Kia ora.
Mahalo, Whina. Sharon?
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here. So my name is Sharon Farnel, and I'm the head of metadata strategies at the University of Alberta, which is located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So in Amiskwaci, Waskagan, traditional lands of Treaty 6 and the Métis Nation. And you know, I'm a settler on this land, an uninvited guest, and you know, of European origin. And so for me, it's a real honor to be able to work with Indigenous colleagues in Alberta, but also in the far north in Canada, on projects around trying to decolonize description and trying to think about how we can change standards and practices, and most importantly, how we can let communities drive the way we describe resources that are from those communities, by those communities, for those communities. And I'm learning every day and making mistakes every day, and just grateful for you know, colleagues who are helping me along that path, and very grateful to be able to be a helper in this work, and to work together with colleagues to try and make things better, make change for the better for access to resources. And I really like the idea of thinking about it as really relationships and connections, because that's really what the work is built on, and those long-term commitments and relationships. And so really excited to be here, and the sessions have been just absolutely amazing and very inspirational today so far. And I'm really excited to continue to learn along with everybody, and have a good discussion about where we're all at and how we can work together to make positive change. So thank you for the opportunity.
Mahalo. Yes, looking forward to this conversation. Again, feel free to raise your hand if you want to be unmuted and ask a question, or put things into the chat. But I'll get us started. And actually, you've already gotten us started, the both of you, talking about relationships. In terms of process, I'm wondering about how it is that you have formed a team. I know that there's the Decolonizing Description Working Group and the Māori Subject Heading Working Group, but how is it that the team came to be? What roles are there on the team? Or what types of expertise were you like, I need to make sure I have a cataloger on this team, but maybe there are less obvious roles. I just wonder if you could talk more about those things. And in our case, has been discussed already, we just so happen to be friends and find ways to continue to work with friends and make that a new way or approach to work in general. So if that's a component, if you could shed light on that as well.
Kia ora tātou. Yeah, so when we first started the project, no one wanted to be on the project team because it was just seemed very hard, very, very hard, and very, very challenging. And so it did require some advocacy on a quite a high level around National Library of New Zealand, and liaison the library profession as well as the Māori kind of arm of the library profession to come together and go, well, we need to bring some people together. What is that makeup? And so it was Māori working in libraries, and really it was about Māori librarians who have knowledge around other Māori coming into libraries, and how are they engaging in libraries, how are they using the collections, how are they accessing those collections. Te reo experts, we never, you know, who's an expert in te reo? Every kind of discipline in a traditional world has its own language, just like hula has a language, just like carving, just like filmmaking has its own language. Who really is a real expert? So it was just someone brave enough who said, yep, I've got time. I don't know what I'm getting myself into, but I'll give it a go. And the other was to ensure we had cataloguing expertise. And at that time, there weren't any Māori catalogers. And it could have been so easy to have a Māori only group, but we just didn't have catalogers that were Māori at the time. Even today, 15 years later, you can count how many Māori that are catalogers, because it has its own, it is a discipline within a discipline. And so, and it is very strict on what those rules are. As long as you know the rules, you can bend them, but you can't break them. But like tikanga Māori, and so that's the makeup. And the makeup has changed over time, because if you are evolving a system that is organising Indigenous knowledge, then it must evolve, and you must have other people come in when the system requires it. So, but initially that was our group. Now we've got all sorts of people particularly Māori experts that aren't in libraries, that aren't in museums and archives, that are on those boards. They could be in art, or they can be in education, but not, it's strictly no longer a library project. So that's how it went. It always comes down to being very clear on what your focus and your goal is, because when you do come up with challenges, and usually it's intellectual versus cultural knowledge versus our own egos. Hey, let's agree, we got egos, eh? Hey, and how do we navigate through it, and have some sort of process of reconciliation? We call it hono hono, or hohau te rongo, and being very very honest. If you're not challenging, and if you're not kind of allowing space to make some mistakes, then you are not being innovative, you're not co-creating and being part of a co-creative process. Yeah, so that's the makeup. I don't, was it right? Yeah, we got it done. we got 500 terms, so yeah, we got it right. Could it have been different? Sure. And we were always open to that. We were always open to having different makeup. Just like Malia, we had kahuna and tohunga come in when it was necessary, when it came to subjects, and drilling down so we could populate our scope noting, so we could find the right hierarchy, because usually Indigenous knowledge is non-linear, right? It's like a circle and a scribble, and it's all over the place, right? Just what Malia was saying, you know. And so how do you still acknowledge these interconnected relationships within a very hierarchical system of cataloguing? And so having people who are open-minded, who's not afraid of hearing the truth, sometimes it hurts, but who's always going back to what the kaupapa or what the vision for this project is, and that it is greater than one individual or even the group. Yeah, that's it.
Wow, I don't know that I have too much to add from our perspective. Very, very similar, I think, and just, you know, really inspirational to hear you talk about your team. And I think our team is very similar. It changed over time, but I think ideally, you know, members from the communities that you're working with are really critical. If you can get them, same challenge. Certainly in Canada, there are a few folks, very small group of folks who are involved in libraries and library work. It's growing for sure, but it's a challenge, and it's trying to make sure that we're not burdening them and asking them to do everything. But that's really ideal, because they you know, have to help guide and really set the direction for the work. So that's really, really so critical. And yeah, folks who know, you know, cataloging and metadata, but who, you know, believe in rethinking the way we approach things, are open to being flexible and thinking about new things in new ways, and open to those difficult conversations, as you said, Whina. That's really important. I think it's important that they believe in the work and understand why it's important. I think sometimes, you know, technical folks, like once you get to the point where you're trying to implement things in technology, you know, getting some systems folks in there to help is always good. And having, you know, a broader group of folks that you can talk to, whether that's elders or friends or colleagues who are from the communities, who you can just sort of informally run ideas by and things like that, is also really helpful. And then I think in our case too, organizationally, some organizational champions, you know, who are maybe not part of the core team, but are there to help support you and advocate for the work and advocate for the resourcing for the work, and who could support that and allow it to be properly resourced and to go on, you know, for the time that it needs, because it's long-term work. And so keeping that interest and that motivation and that investment can be challenging. So I think having those champions to help you do that, I think are really, really critical. And I think, but having folks who are flexible and open to thinking about things in different new ways, I think is really the core quality that you're looking for.
Would you say like the process that this is taking is a new process, or borrowing from other areas, or no, this is how things happen in your library usually, in terms of embarking on this work,
That's a good question. I think it was probably, and I know Anne is here, she might say the same. I think it was quite different. I mean, in terms of, we'd had many initiatives of different kinds working with our local First Nations communities and others. So we had experience in sort of working with community in collaborative ways and on different things. So that piece was maybe not so different for us, but tackling something like subject headings, something around that piece was very, very new for us. And so that, I think, was the different piece of it. And then also committing to sort of a long-term process, I think, was different for us. Quite often our groups get formed, we do a thing, and then the group goes away. And so I think understanding that this was work that was going to take time and it was going to be ongoing work always, really, was a bit different for us. So some similarities, I think, some differences in our context.
Yeah, totally agree with Sharon. Parts of it was different. I mean, knowing cataloguing and being Māori was totally different for me, and for the cataloguers, kind of being in the same space where you had those sessions like with Malia and Kia Hiahi and Marie, to see that process is really quite unique. And so having people open on both sides to listen and understand how structure is with cataloguing, but also that world view. And also, I totally agree with Sharon, is you've got to also understand the ebbs and flows of your community about how much information and how much of their time do you take from them. If you are taking a long-term view, that this is a long-term project, and at this present moment, you're part of it right now, not knowing who's taking part of it in the future. So having that, making sure that reciprocity is in there when you're connecting with your communities, and also just acknowledging like cups of teas. Might get bored with cups of teas, but they're really important. Cups of teas and food is really important. And also to always touch base, not just with the living tupuna, but also with the immortal tupuna. So a good example of that was the film today, and where George Helm, he connected with the tupuna in the church by singing a song that came from another tupuna in another time. So remember, you can get your inspiration and your anchoring from the living as well as the immortal. Yeah.
Aloha, Sharon and Whina. I have a question for you two that sort of popped into my head as you folks were talking. It's a little bit related to what we're talking about now. I was wondering what your folks' inspirations were, and like where are the sources that you folks looked to for designing the idea or moving forward with the plan? You know what I mean? We're sort of, we've looked to your folks' projects, and which has been so helpful for us. So just wondering where you folks look to.
Yeah, so I think where you are right now, where you have no idea where it's going, is probably the best place to be quite honest with you, because you don't want to get yourself stuck in a system that you've made a commitment to when there's perhaps some other alternative. So just what Sharon was saying, keep open, because you'll know in time when you do your research, I mean, there's so many Māori forms of organising knowledge to look at, and there's evidence of that, and some of it is written and some of it is oral tradition, and so it's been able to tap those. We're so lucky because even though it just feels like 5 people in a room, there's actually a whole kind of hundreds of people outside of that group that is starting to get to know what your project is about and wants to participate and wants to give some information. And we always made sure we, just like what Anne-Marie was saying, we didn't take it, but we did hold that knowledge and take a look at it from the perspective of the project. So seek all your structures everywhere. don't and it will, it's like a funnel, right? So it starts like a big huge tornado going like this, big funnel until it starts moving down until you get some sort of core. But hearing where you are and you have no idea, not too sure what the scope notes are, and we haven't, you know, and the challenges that Malia put to you, and you have no idea, that sounds like the right place to be at the moment.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Whina. I would, you know, we looked everywhere and we still look everywhere, and we really tried to look to see what folks in you know, around the world had been doing, developing their own systems, sort of working with existing systems but tweaking them, you know, talking to colleagues who had undergone this sort of work, who had, you know, worked with communities, who had tried to address this issue, getting a sense of, you know, what they were doing and thinking, but in the end still trying to come back to what's going to make the most sense in our context, and hoping that we could kind of, as you said, sort of funnel all of those things and get all those pieces of information and, you know, all the pieces of the puzzle, and hope that one day it, you know, the picture becomes clear as you start to put those pieces in place. And so, you know, but there's so much going on in this area, and it seems like more and more all the time, that it's sometimes just so hard to know what people are up to, which is why events like this are so critical, because it's learning about what other people are doing. And that's one of the challenges, but we're really just trying to absorb everything we can and look and take the pieces that we can take that make sense in our context, but know that, you know, we've got to make it make sense in our context. And that might mean it's just a little bit different than what everybody else has done, but that's okay. So.
Definitely. And Whina, as you were talking about cups of tea, I was remembering what Anne said about many cups of tea and a couple of margaritas on the patio. I put that as recommendations for how we move forward in our project. Mahalo, Anne. I was wondering, and you know, you folks are sharing about looking not just inward but outward as well, and wondering, as you selected your starting place, you know, subject headings or name authority, place names, how did we, once there is an understanding that this work is needed and important, how did you choose that starting place, and why did you choose that as your starting place?
Yeah, starting point for us was just to see, because it is about what is published about Māori people and Māori knowledge, and how do we engage it. So it's always to go back to the source of why we're doing this and what is out there. You know, 15 years ago, we'd be lucky if there was, you know, 3,000 to maybe 5,000 publications that is with a lot of Māori, more than 50% of Māori content. Now there's about 25,000. So, which is probably the same with Hawaiian knowledge as well. So it's always going back to what is being written. So, and then dealing with those subject headings first is going to be the most relevant, because there's something already, a body of knowledge, a body of publications that I've already written. So that's kind of where we started when it came to figuring out what was important. Kapahaka, so Māori performing arts, you know, it's blown up in the last 10 years, but 15 years ago, it wasn't so much. But we could see the future, and sometimes it was about projecting some of those subjects that we knew that were coming right now. So when cataloguers had those publications coming out, they already had the subject headings as well. So having a bit of what you've got now, and maybe kind of looking forward to some of those subjects was helpful. That's how we did it anyway. And then we just had people tell us what they wanted.
Does that include your National Library, Whina? I was wondering if you could add about those pieces. Did they sort of, you know, set some direction for you folks, or were they in the driver's seat or the back seat, or?
They were at the driver's seat really early on, until we said you need to step back a bit so we could actually do. Again, it's about being relevant, because we've got a lot of catalogued material that is relevant, but not to Māori who are searching for it. And so it was like, we need to create some relevance to the existing cataloguing records, and create new records. So yeah, they were in the front, and then they went to the side a bit, they went to the back. When it came to the launch, because it was so successful, the group went to the back and let our advocates, our champions take it all, you know, with the accolades, which is fair enough, because we knew we wanted those advocates to continue to be advocates right through, and they have been for the last 15 years. So it was worth it.
And I think it's similar for us, I think, in terms of where we started. We started with subject headings for a couple of reasons. There's a lot more, there's so much of the work in this area is working on subject headings. So we knew that there would be a lot to look to for inspiration, a lot of folks that we could learn from in terms of how they had approached it. And then thinking also realistically, our library has probably a vast majority of our resources are electronic, which means students and faculty engage with subject headings. They don't necessarily engage with a classification for an electronic resource. That's what they see and engage with. So that was another reason why maybe starting with subject headings might have a more immediate impact. Another logistical reality is that working with classification means there may be actual physical implications for moving collections. And so that was something we thought maybe that's a little bit further down the line. And so we thought maybe starting with subject headings, there was things we could learn, we could develop some processes and things like that that we could then take and use to work with classification systems. And the other one that we had thought about and we're still, of course, very interested in was working with, the names, so the names of individual communities and nations and groups. But we knew there was a lot of work happening across the country in communities in particular, where they're developing their own resources around place names and community names and so on. And so again, thinking through that, let that work go through and come to fruition, and so that we could then use the work that they're doing. And then we're also not sort of, asking them for their time and energy on that when they're trying to focus on that time and energy on doing that for themselves. So that's kind of how we decided subject headings it was sort of very pragmatic in that way.
And even within subject headings, you folks, or at least one of the starting points has been on, I don't know how to say this, like naming ourselves, right? I had noticed in your survey screenshot, Sharon, you had included that question. To the level of how do you refer to your community? And do you include the word people in it, like getting down into it? And I know Whina, like the ʻIwi hapu names list and those kinds of things. Can you talk more about the process for coming about with those decision-making or decisions around those types of names, or why you started there? And I asked this because for us, we are starting with ʻAina place names and a place name authority list. And so I'm just wondering, it seems to me to be somewhat similar in that sense. So if you could shine a light on those things.
Yeah, I mean, we started with iwi, hapu, ris, and then place names because, yeah, just sick of seeing people. Hey, in subject headings, just people. Like, who are they? You know, other than Māori, you've got these tribal nations that have language, you know, that's totally different. And so it was to, because subject headings are quite generic, where place names are in relationship to people of the land. And so that was a way to put a bit of a sovereignty stamp on it without saying it, without saying it. Putting a sovereignty stamp on and a location and mana to those iwi nations and tribal spaces. And so again, that was different to the way we dealt with. We went to iwi authorities and told them to tell us what their place names were and how do they want to define their boundaries and their waka and their tupuna. And that was actually more simpler, I have to say, than actually getting Māori subject headings, because you know the authorities within those iwi groups. They have runanga, and then that's who we engaged, and then they told us who we needed to talk to. So that's why we dealt with it that way.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I think for us, so much of the feedback that we hear and have heard and continue to hear from community members is that you know, as Whina said, sort of this idea that everything is so often so generic, right? And, you know, a subject heading will be, this book is about Indigenous peoples, or it's about First Nations. Well, what you need to be specific and say, if it's about multiple First Nations, that's fine. But if it's about a specific nation, you need to name that nation, right? And that's it. You should be very specific. And so the importance of then thinking about, okay, if we're going to be specific, we want to make sure that the term that is being used for that community is the term the community uses for themselves, right? And so that is that next step of saying, okay, well, it's not up to us to name your community. You name your community, it's your community, right? So what is that community name? And certainly that's kind of coinciding too, I think, with a lot of activity and initiatives across First Nations and communities in Canada who are really going through this process themselves of reclaiming their names and really thinking through the names that they are using, the names that are going to be the official names, you know, getting rid of, you know, those old colonial names and things like that. So it was sort of a natural way to say, okay, what is your community? How do you name yourself? And you know, how's that spelled? What is that going to look like in English? And what is it going to look like in Cree? And all of those sorts of questions. So it was just really trying to think through that from that perspective, because that was just one of the really, really common things we heard, is that you need to name the nation or the nations. And in order to do that, we need to understand what the communities name themselves. And many of them are going through this process right now of trying to understand what they want to name themselves and really reclaiming those names. And so it just all kind of came together nicely in that way. And still lots of initiatives going on across the nation in different communities to really think that through. So it's really exciting to see that. And that's then information that we can take and say, this is how the community names itself. So that's the name that we're going to use in our subject heading.
Exactly. And I think it absolutely is a form of sovereignty and reclaiming our names, and ʻāina for us at least. And in working with the various consultants in this project and others, we just talk story, right, with others who are doing research or in their own cultural practices. And that's been part of our motivation as well. It's like, how do we, there's other work happening in our community. How does this support that work? How do we support the reclaiming of whatever practice it may be? So one of the folks we work with does kapwa. So I'm thinking of Antile Ishikawa. And she comes back to me even and says, you know, I'm trying to organize my own research. How do I put these tabs together? And so that, you know, others can, as she goes out and holds workshops with others and tries to get the ike out there to her haumana, how can she go about this? And I turn the question right back around to her so slyly and say, how can we do this? Yes, it's not the library anymore telling you this is how it should be. It's what do you think? What's going to make it easier or more helpful for you in this work? Because that's where we want to be. So absolutely. Just along with that, I think too here, or in my experience, there's an awakening as well to Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous knowledge in general. Language for sure, but the methodologies that are in language and in our practices, more and more, as Whina, you mentioned, there's more and more publications coming out. And while we already have lots of publications talking about Hawaiian methodologies, these are being more explicit in how they talk about methodologies. And I think that's helping others to grasp, even just at an introductory level, those types of things, so that we can begin to work with them within spaces that, you know, weren't the only people in those spaces. But I was wondering if that was your experience as well, in terms of, how do I say, paipaing like Indigenous knowledge, like bringing Indigenous knowledge and methodologies to the forefront in your work, and how does that take hold when you're talking to administrators or other librarians even, or whoever it may be, in terms of saying, no, this is the approach, this is the framework we're choosing, or all of you have highlighted the importance of conversation in this work and it being long-term. These are not things that are commonly accepted within institutions, I will say, at least in my short experience. And so how do you sort of navigate those questions? And has it been your experience as well, or are we just eons behind you folks in terms of openness to Indigenous knowledge and methodologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot more popular now than it was 15 years ago. Indigenous methodologies and having some value intellectually, but also within knowledge spaces such as museums, libraries, archives. So it's definitely a lot more popular now than it was 15 years ago. And hey, we're just telling the story, and we just keep telling story and making sure that our advocates like National Library and Te Rōpū Whakahau and Lianza are telling exactly the same story, and are continually making it accessible, but also, you know, that partnership now has a New Zealand Libraries Partnership Program, which embeds Māori subject headings into training of all library staff across the whole country. So that didn't happen overnight, whānau. You know, it's taken us 12 years to get to that point where it is absolutely part of professional development of emerging librarians, but how wonderful, and it's just kind of evolved that way. I think there's a double-edged sword that I think Malia kind of picked up on, it is how much of Indigenous knowledge systems do you give to the public outside of the Indigenous culture, or perhaps the discipline in which that methodology has come. And so there are I think there are ways in which you can protect knowledge and put knowledge caveats that have conditions, and really the public doesn't need to know it. It's already embedded in the method and the system that you put in place, and that will come in time. And being told off once in a while. Don't be afraid to be told off once in a while that, hey, get that word out of there. And there might be a really good reason and rationale around it. And it may be it's that perhaps that subject heading should remain within traditional knowledge holders who are practitioners, who are kumu and who are tohunga. And that to me is good rationality about that, and that's okay. You know, so I'm gonna leave it there now.
I mean, I could just add a little bit. I think I would agree that I think that it's sort of an openness to different methodologies and to Indigenous approaches, I think is changing a lot. And I think within our context, I think at the university, we're fairly fortunate in that we have sort of initiatives across campus and many Indigenous scholars and elders and so on. So I think there is more of an openness there than there has been in the past. But I will say, I think one of our biggest struggles in this work is sort of pacing and timing. And certainly, we started, our work group was formed in 2016. So here we are almost 6 years later. And I think we all feel like we're just beginning this work. We're just in those early baby steps still. And we certainly struggle sometimes with some colleagues and administration with that, just getting the right pace, right? Not going too fast, but not going too slow, right? It's trying to find that the right pace. Is sometimes people, and quite often it's out of very good intentions, but they want to see more change more quickly. But the way it's always, in talking to colleagues and the way it's always been explained is that, the idea is that even if you're doing something, you're taking an old heading and putting in a new heading, that even if that heading is in the abstract sense better, if you just unilaterally put it in there yourself without talking to community and understanding if that's what they really want, then you're just perpetuating the same problem. So it's trying to find that right pace, right? Showing that we're not dragging our feet. We're not going slow because we don't want to make change or we're avoiding those tough decisions, but also doing it at the pace that makes sense for the community and makes sense for the work. And so that, I think, can be a big challenge in those kind of getting support and that ongoing support, just knowing that it's going to take time and just trying to find that right pace, I think, is something that we struggle with, I think, every day for sure.
For sure. I wonder, Sharon, if you can expand on what support looks like. I have a private message about philanthropic support that you may have received, or is it government support? And I think it's unique for each of you in your lahui, but if you could expand upon what support has looked like.
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that. I mean, I think we are for our project at the University of Alberta Library, we're very fortunate that we have from the library administration, we have very good support. They're very, sort of this work is part of our strategic initiatives, part of our strategic goals, which it fits in, with a larger institutional strategic goal. So that's always very good, right? If, from a very pragmatic sense, you get that support from the institution if you can show what you're doing as part of their strategic initiative. So there's that sense that this is important and it needs to be done. So that's really good, that kind of support there. We've been, again, quite fortunate in the library in terms that we have been, we've been going through some challenges recently with budget reductions, some severe budget reductions, which is a whole other story, but still, relatively speaking, quite well resourced. So there is still funding available within the library, and this is considered to be, again, because it is strategic and it's important work and it's acknowledged as important work, there is support for the staff we have working on this to be spending their time working on this. So there's that support for the work that we're doing and so on. And there is some budget to help us with things like when we have knowledge gathering events and we want to get a local First Nations caterer to come and create, make bannock and stew and so on. So there's money there. It's not unlimited, but there is, money there that we can use for all those things that's important. We haven't had any sort of outside support for this work in terms of grants or philanthropic support or anything like that. I think there's been some conversations about, is that something that we could pursue? Would people be interested in that? But we haven't kind of gone down that road yet. So we've been fortunate that the library has funded this so far, and we'll hope that will continue to be the case. But again, we know we're in a very fortunate place, right, where our institution is able to do that. And we know not everybody's in a place where that can happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. I mean, the kind of the ongoing long term, which has been 15 years now, has been the operational budget. So I think 2 years into it, first you have to get it out of a project scope, because once you get it out of project, then you are challenging someone, the institution, to put some operational budget towards it or some capital yearly budget towards it. And so we made sure we forced it out of project mode, and because we're a bit feisty and going, come on, National Library, we want you to commit to it. And so they did, and they a very small operational budget, but it doesn't grow, but at least it's there every year. And so that's been really how it's been funded. The other advocates, like Leanza, they put money towards travel and accommodation for the Māori subject headings group to come and meet 4 or 5 times a year. And so every partner is kind of putting in money yearly on different parts of it. You know, the last 5 years hasn't been about the cataloguers, it's been about librarians in the customer facing and being able to use subject headings to share them with Indigenous people to how to use them. So it's not just, I think our cataloguers are pretty good now. It's the other side. So it has evolved we didn't try, just like Sharon said, pace yourself, ebb and flow it, because sometimes there's just no money because there's huge budget cuts, and that's okay as long as there's, and that's fine, as long as there's, you know, something there to keep us going, and then we're rich again after 3 years. Whoever's in power, you know, and their portfolio has something to do with Indigenous people that they want to deal with, then hey, that's the opportunity to do it. So having someone who's lobbying and also having someone who is keeping an eye on funding and grants is important. But yeah, the Māori subject headings, I think that was Deborah. I'm just answering a question really quickly. Catalogue records in Aotearoa. Yep, they're in WorldCat. They're everywhere. Yeah. So and so you can use them, apply them, or just copycat. Copy the catalogue record, which is so much easier for our smaller community libraries and towns that cannot afford to have maybe a full-time cataloguer to do all that work.
Mahalo, Deborah, for the question. Also, aloha, Deborah, welcome. And here in Hawaii, we've been fortunate that for 3 years now, IMLS has supported us with the grants to launch, at least setting the foundation for a Hawaiian knowledge organization system. Obviously focused on creating those controlled vocabularies. But as you folks have talked about repeatedly, or it stands out to me at least, it's those forming of relationships, building the team, getting the buy-in so that others see, you know, how this is important, how this fits into their work. And you've also touched upon other things, and I'm kind of curious just about that. You talked about how, you know, Whina, you mentioned now professional development for librarians includes more cultural types of content. And then Sharon, I know with you folks working with Dodi and creating digital libraries and those projects, which are seemingly parallel. And I wonder if you could share about at least another project or another idea that is moving forward, where you are, that feeds into this work with knowledge organization. It's not the actual creation of subject headings, but it feeds into it.
Yeah, so for us, it's now looking at data as being data sovereignty. So it's kind of evolved to say, yep, we've now got access. Now we know what's in these institutions. Now we want them back. And so that's one of the outcomes of making Indigenous knowledge available, or at least seen. It can be seen. Because, you know, the catalogue is the doorway. You know, it's a digital doorway, and then it's finally getting our people to approach the physical threshold of an institution. You know, even that in itself is a challenge for Indigenous people to do. But once they do, then they start questioning, well, what are you doing with this information? and how can we be part of taking care of that information. To the institution, it's a little bit different. The thinking is around ownership, where I think Indigenous thinking is more about, well, we want to use it, therefore we want to contextualize it within ourselves, and to do that we need to take care of it. So there's a guardianship or custodianship kind of way of thinking when it comes to knowledge. So data sovereignty is quite big in Aotearoa at the moment, and the repatriation of knowledge. It used to be physical things like taonga and treasures within our museums. Now it's a question of intellectual knowledge, and it's better served that we're taking care of it, because we know we can enhance those collections beyond your structures and beyond your European kind of systems. And we can also, because we are the community, we're able to disseminate it out to where it needs to go. So that's kind of where it is. As I said, for libraries, they're doing we're continuing to do training around cataloguing, but it's for customer services librarians. Yep. And that's been taken up, and that's been really good. Yeah, so I'm sure there's more, but I have no idea.
I think for us it's very, I'm glad, Whina, that you mentioned talking about data sovereignty, because I think that's a big part of where we're seeing that. Another aspect of all of this work coming out in our library is around the collections, and of course, Kayla Larson, who you're going to hear from a little bit later on today, did some really great work when she worked with us as an academic library resident in developing guidelines and protocols for how to work with communities, and part of that was really focused on helping us identify communities that we could work with to look at some of the things that we had in our collections and try and understand, should those still be in our collections? Should those be something we should be working with community to bring back to community, whether in its physical original form or some digital repatriation form, or even understanding if there a decision by the community was that we would continue to be the stewards, what's appropriate access to those sorts of things and all of those pieces. So that's a really big piece that's been picking up as well around that collections piece. And then also around, we have a very active digitization program. So a lot of that, and again, ties into both the description, but also sort of the data sovereignty piece, and really thinking through how to appropriately determine what could be digitized, should be digitized, who should be involved with that, what communities do we need to consult with, all of those sorts of things. So we're definitely seeing it shift a lot in parallel in the collection space, which is really exciting to see, for sure. And I think we've had some conversations too around some of our other descriptive practices, like say in archives and things like that, but those conversations are going a little bit more slowly just because we're very short staffed on that side, but just kind of thinking about other kinds of description too, beyond sort of catalog records, but thinking about, okay, when we start talking about archival descriptions and things like that. So definitely, I think there's a whole flurry of things that are interrelated that are really kind of coming to the fore, which I think is actually all really a great thing to see.
Yeah, and just picking up again with Sharon, that you said a while back was about classifications. So there is that evolution to, well, how do you classify, and what does it look like physically in a collection? Is it separated? Has it got its own space? And is it still in Dewey, or has it got another form in which it's classified within a physical space? Same thing with digitizing and around data sovereignty. 10 years ago when digitizing, or 15 years ago when digitizing was really fresh, institutions in New Zealand were saying to Māori groups, community groups, well, how about you have the digital copy and we maintain the original? Now what communities are saying, how about you keep the digital copy version and we take the original? And so the thinking and that management of knowledge is changing, and I love it. It's exciting. It's exciting when a group, a iwi group comes in and goes, you keep the digital, we take the original. And that's exciting to me. It's quite challenging for an institution because I saw it the other way around. You know, and I think our communities did too, but we're 10 years going forward in the digital space and they're going, nah. No, you keep the digital, we'll have the original, because for us it will always be about context, the context of it, because knowledge isn't knowledge, it's because it has a relationship with tupuna. And so it's almost a saying around, we have a saying where it says, ko te tupuna, he chiaki te mokopuna, ko te mokopuna he chiaki te tupuna. The ancestor takes care of their descendants, but the descendants also take care of the ancestors. And if that's broken, if that relationship or link is broken, then we are forever poorer. We are spiritually poor, we are physically poor. And so reconnecting, and that's been the argument at the moment. It's exciting, but just also kind of what in Canada and what they're doing with the digital and enriching them with the stories, you know, has, you know, that's impactful because the enrichment is coming from the community. That's changed.
And I think too, for us, we focus on those relationships too. I mean, we talked a lot about relationship with community and with colleagues within libraries and things like that, but switching gears a little bit to talk about the actual structures and terminology, as you saw in our last session with Hoʻokele, we're looking at what are the concepts and how are we linking them, and what are their different types of relationships? What are the names of those relationships? And is there a ranking of relationships, right? Is it a weighted relationship? And I think this relates to Nancy's question in the chat in terms of how linked data plays a role in this work. And specifically, she's asking, has linked data affected your thinking about creating subject terms? If you want to make comments about linked data or relationships between terms in the systems that you're working on. Also, while you're thinking of your answer, I want to encourage people, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute.
Yeah, I mean, linked data, we have to have linked data because as it's been brought up, the terms are related. They're all related. The words are all related. So we have to have them. And then on one side of it, I'm also on the other side of it saying there's some relationships that should remain within the community and should be kept within the community, and that community knows what those relationships are. Okay, because you know you are opening it up to interpretation. I mean, I don't know how many times I've gone into you know, intellectual databases where someone's has, you know, there's 5 intellectuals that have written about something I've done. And they don't even know me, they don't know the project, you know, but that's because it's out in the open. And, you know, and I read it and I go, oh, okay, I won't get too, you know, too precious about that, because I know that some relationships within the project is still within the community and it isn't part of the public. You have to determine how you do that, how you do the interlinking, and how do you not. Do you know what I mean? Keep some knowledge that stays within Indigenous because you still have practitioners, not as many as we used to, agreed, but we still have our practitioners who are practicing and who are disseminating traditional knowledge the old way, face to face. Yeah. Will Auntie Google take that over? No, because Auntie Google doesn't care about the consequences of that knowledge that you have, and a kumu and a tohunga does, because there is cost and consequences when it comes to knowledge, as we all know, and there are conditions to practicing it. Does Auntie Google care about that? No.
Yeah, no, I would agree completely, and I think it. I see Margaret's got a comment in the chat there about the idea of disrupting this notion of authority. What does authority mean? What is that whole idea? Whose authority, right? Whose authority says that this is the term? And I think the thing to think about with linked data, at least the way I think about it, is we can use linked data principles and ideas to help inform how we model. So we can think about the idea of not having a single term that has to be privileged over other terms, that there are multiple ways of referring to something, and multiple ways of understanding something, multiple ways of approaching something. And those are all equal and valid and just as important as the others. So thinking about using linked data principles to help us model things in that way, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to make that linked data open. We don't have to put it out onto the web and make it, completely available to everybody, or we don't necessarily have to model those relationships, as Finna said, that really shouldn't be modeled in that way necessarily, or made, modeled alongside other things because they're sort of important, protected cultural knowledge. So I think taking some of the principles and getting us to think differently about this idea of one single term to rule them all, so to speak, but not necessarily meaning that we have to take that and make the data completely open. You can model it and not have it completely open, and that's totally okay too. There's very appropriate reasons to not do that. So I think there's definitely some potential benefits, but being mindful of the drawbacks as well, and being careful about how we approach it, I think is as Finna said, is really the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one hang up we keep having, or just keep coming up against, is the technology to be able to simulate what we're talking about within this system. There's a lot of challenges, not just in terms of being able to properly display ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi, but just the ways in which we understand things to be related. The structures we're working with don't allow for those relationships to be represented. And so that's what's tough. And a lot of the feedback we got when, Kiaiai Mao were sharing the structure in the last session, a lot of the feedback is, it's limiting, or there's this, and actually this is related here, and this goes in all the places. That is something we talk about every time we have a conversation. And I will add to that we at one point thought we mocked it up. We did it. We did this piece. And we went back to community and they were like, no, you're missing this and this and this and this. And so definitely had to check the ego, take the scoldings. It wasn't scoldings. They're very kind and gracious about it. But and then say, you know what, okay, we didn't get it. We're gonna listen to you. We're gonna take this feedback and we're gonna mock something up and put it back in front of you and see where that goes. So yeah, definitely. Sorry, Kiaiai, were you gonna add something as well?
Mahalo for that, Shavonn. Yeah, I'm thinking about your folks' discussion about authority, and yeah, right, because I got caught up in the synonym rings and everything is everything. But we also understand that at least for Wai Hāpai that I've been engaged with, there are hierarchies in our communities. There definitely is authority in our community, and there are different aspects that are authority at different time, right? And so it's not just about linking all the terms, but it's about advancing that which is most appropriate at that time. So waiting for someone to figure that out and make that happen. I have a question about the two of you, and for all of you in this room. I'm wondering about your folks' well-being and how the project and the work you folks are doing and engaging with, if that has affected your well-being, if it's affected your identity, if it's affected your worldviews, if it's affected your values. And I ask because these are things that we're wrestling with on our team.
Yeah, I mean, you become a champion all day, every day. You're learning to become one in a space like this, because you are pushing some boundaries, and you are challenging not just the institutional kind of open-mindedness, but also the open-mindedness of your own people. And so you start to get it's that whole thing about pacing and breathing, learning to breathe again through the times when you've got slow times, and not losing yourself and your own identity with it, but it's be gentle. Yeah, it can get really hard if you're not being, you're the face of it, but also know that there's ebbs and flows to your project, where you don't always have to be facing it, and you can get on with having some sort of normality in your life. But not so much while you're in project. I'll be real. I'll be honest. Okay, suck it up a little bit, whānau. Just a little bit, because it is a little bit hard. Okay, just suck it up a little bit. When you need to have a nervous breakdown, then do so. Have one, but then put your big pants on again. Get back into it while you're in project. And listen to the people who love you, who say you need a break. You look like crap. Listen, yeah. Or your body will tell you, and you will drop. And there's been many times in the project that happened for every single person in every single different kind of way. And so you have to allow for some space, and be honest with your grant to the people who gave you the money too about that, because it's real, and it's big stuff that you're asking of yourself, and that your people who grant the money is also. But if you're honest with it, they will understand the brevity of this project. Hey, I just want to say before I forget, scope noting, and Anne-Marie is taking care of that. And so you need to define what your scope noting is for. And maybe some of that is explaining relationships, okay, for the cataloger who's going to use that term. Okay, don't be afraid, and you can add the traditional use of it, and now the contemporary use of that term. So your scope notes are one of your most powerfulest tools and most helpful tools for your catalogers. Kia kaha whānau.
I would just add to what Whina said. I would second everything that Whina said about, taking care of yourself and all of those things. And I would just like to say, I think for me personally, the work that I've been part of and still am part of at the university, and in particular the work with the Inuvialuit community up north, like people like Dodie and others, is just really, it's really profoundly changed me as a person and as a librarian. And it's really made me shift my focus and really think about trying to focus the work that I do in metadata on the things that I think really can make a positive difference in a really meaningful way. So it's really got me to completely rethink the things I kind of want to spend my time on as a professional, and to try and find ways of putting that kind of ethic and that kind of approach into everything that I do in metadata. So it really has just, profoundly changed me as a researcher and as a human and as a librarian. And I'm, eternally grateful for that. So yeah, absolutely. Without a doubt, changes me every day for sure.
We have a couple of questions, but I do want to ask this one. In terms of, Helen asks, do factors of the digital divide influence your structures, descriptions, and platforms? And I would add, in addition to digital divide, if you want to comment on COVID, because it's brought this issue to the forefront for many of us, particularly those of us who have spotty or non-existent service. So
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit for, I think in our library context, I think we struggle, of course, with, with students and faculty and so on who have, very differing levels of access to, our catalog and resources like that. So I don't know that it has changed our approach to that, to the work that we do, but we have to just acknowledge that, people do have differing situations, and we can't assume that people are going to have easy access to resources. And I think in the case of the Alawitt Digital Library and in that project, that it comes much more into focus. There's far up north in Canada, there are certainly government initiatives to bring broadband up there, but certainly internet access is a real issue in some of the communities for sure. And so one of the things we've always been talked about in the beginning, and we've done a few test cases of this, is actually having local copies of the digital library installed on computers in the main places that people in the community go to access information, to share information. So this could be the community center, the school, the community corporation, which is sort of each community in the settlement region has kind of a community corp that's kind of the center of all of their self-governance and so on. And those are the places people go to talk, to get information, to chat with each other, all those sorts of things. So we've talked about, having sort of static copies of the digital library installed on computers there, so people can go, because the internet there is always the best. And so that usually in those places, it's good enough that, they can watch the videos and listen to the audio with, just minor buffering. And then what we would do is, regular trips from Inuvik out to the communities, the community corps have folks going back and forth all the time. So once or twice a year, kind of put a refreshed, updated, revised version of the digital library there. So hopefully in that way, that's we can kind of address some of the digital divide issues. It's not perfect, but certainly that's something that the community has talked to us about and said, this is something we do with other things as well. And so this might be a way to approach that. So it definitely has impacted how we've approached the work, because the idea of the library is for it to be accessible to the community members. So thinking through from the technological perspective in particular, what that actually means.
And I know we're at time, but I do want to leave us with maybe any parting thoughts you folks have. And if it helps, I can pose a question, which is, what strategies or advice would you like to share with others interested in or actively pursuing knowledge organization work for their communities? What did you want to come from the work that you're doing, or how would you advise others who are looking to do this for our own communities? Or any other parting thoughts you want to share with us?
I think I saw a question there just around how do we get, how did 15 years ago about support from National Library or whatever. And at the time I was working at Auckland Libraries, and our National Library did say if you must get support from your institution, in that you'll be in Wellington for 2 days out of 3 days, for 6 months or something like that. So that's how we got support from the beginning, is ask for it, right at the onset, ask for it. And for others who are doing with community and who want to start, just start, just begin, and gather around you like-minded people who want the same thing, and who are willing to put time and energy into it, and just start telling stories, start talking about it, and then figure out a plan to get it done. Hey, we're all here now. I mean, Canada, Hawaii, and New Zealand are here, Aotearoa are here. If you want to start, I'm always a strong advocate for Indigenous people around the world to do this, because the impact is a huge one. You don't know it yet. You don't know how huge the impact is until you start doing it and go, wow. So yeah, take care of yourselves, team. Hey, Shavonn, Anne-Marie, Tabina, Kiahiahi, and just pace yourself, the ebb and flow. Sharon knows the ebb and flow, and it will have a profound effect on your lives, both positive and negative, but it makes you the person who you want to be. I know it did for me. I know I wanted to kind of figure out who the heck I was, and am I native, am I Indigenous, and what makes me Indigenous, and so personally it had a profound effect on me, and then that kind of permeates out through everything I do. So thank you.
I would just like to add, yeah, from as someone who is not non-Indigenous, and just for me, it's important to share what I've learned, is to educate yourself, be patient, and most of all, approach the work with humility and a willingness to listen and learn, and step aside and engage with community in a really honest, reciprocal way. And as Whina said, it can seem daunting, but every little step counts. So just take that first little step, and everything will fall into place after that. So thank you again, Whina, and everyone for the opportunity, and good luck with the project. It's amazing, and it's going to be fantastic.
Mahalo, Sharon, and mahalo, Whina. That was beautiful. So I came to meeting Whina and Sharon actually by chance at two separate events, and just I guess by chance also, Whina might say, Kupuna led us there, but through that informal conversation, it led through partnership, and they've been gracious enough to allow us to call upon them as we work on our project going forward. And so this space today was introduction to these two brilliant folks, but also the power of conversation and where it can lead us in the various works we may do, sometimes obviously and sometimes less obvious. It just comes up 5 years later, right, Sharon? And so just want to encourage you folks to have these types of conversations with us here in Hawaii, with others that you may be interacting with in your various work as well. And just know that this was just, today is ongoing conversation that we continue with Hoʻokele Naʻauao, but also just continue in Hawaii. And so we hope to continue this conversation around knowledge organization with you all as we move forward over the next year of Wai Hāpai, but also into the future. However long it may take, we're going to create this thing, we're going to lift it off the ground, and it will be great for our communities. And so we hope to have you folks along for this wild ride with us. So mahalo, and I hope this is not the closing of the day. We have another session coming up shortly with Kayla Larson talking exactly what Whina and Sharon mentioned about Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous stewardship. So looking forward to that with Kayla. Hope you'll join us in just a few minutes. But for now, enjoy the break. Mahalo kako, mahalo for joining us.